Are you challenging my tactics, Lieutenant, or are you challenging me? The room went dead silent. 83 combat pilots, 6 nations, not one of them breathing. And Tyler Mercer, 26 years old, the highest simulator scores in his class, looked Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Callahan straight in the eye and said, "The best way to settle that is in the air, ma'am." Nobody moved. The NATO pilots stared at him like a man who had just stepped off a cliff without checking the drop, because they knew something Tyler did not. They knew exactly why she was called Ghost. And they knew he was already finished, he just didn't know it yet. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel right now. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, and stay with us all the way to the end. Tyler Mercer had never walked into a room and felt anything other than ready. That was the thing about him that people noticed first, not his scores, not his reflexes, not the way he could read a tactical display faster than pilots 10 years older than him. What people noticed was the way he carried himself, shoulders back, chin level, eyes moving across a room like he was already calculating who in it he needed to worry about and who he did not. At 26 years old, First Lieutenant Tyler Blaze Mercer had already decided that the answer was almost always nobody, and had reasons, real ones. His simulator scores at pilot training had been the highest in his class. His instructors had written words like exceptional spatial awareness and accelerated threat processing in evaluations that most young pilots only dreamed about receiving. In controlled exercises against experienced opponents, he had won engagements that he had no business winning, turning fights around through sheer processing speed and an almost physical refusal to accept that he was losing. He had heard the word gifted attached to his name so many times that it had stopped meaning anything to him. It was simply a fact like altitude or airspeed, a number on a display that confirmed what he already knew. So when he arrived at Nellis Air Force Base for one of the largest red flag exercises of the year, Tyler did not arrive with nerves. He arrived with a plan. The exercise itself was the kind of thing that made ordinary pilots' hands sweat before they even climbed into a cockpit. American F-35 squadrons flying alongside NATO partners from Germany, Britain, Norway, Italy, and the Netherlands. A simulated near-peer conflict environment, layered with electronic interference, deceptive radar, contacts communications that would cut in and out at the worst possible moments, and an opposing force specifically designed to hunt down overconfident pilots and make them look foolish in front of everyone they respected. For most people, that description was a warning. For Tyler, it sounded like an opportunity. He spent his first evening at Nellis the way he always spent his first evening anywhere, walking the spaces, slowly reading people's reactions, calculating the landscape. He watched how the NATO pilots grouped themselves, which American officers they deferred to, which conversations stopped when certain people walked in. And that was when he noticed something strange. There was a woman moving through the room, mid-40s. He guessed nothing about her that immediately stood out. Medium height, quiet in the way that some senior officers got quiet when they had been doing dangerous things long enough that they stopped needing to announce themselves. She wore a flight suit with a single patch on the left shoulder, faded almost to gray with one word printed across it: Ghost. Tyler filed it away and turned back to the conversation he was having with 2 pilots from his squadron. He assumed she was one of the exercise controllers, or maybe a liaison from some other program. Someone administrative, someone important in the way that administrative people sometimes got important through paperwork and time served not through anything that actually mattered inside a cockpit. I was still thinking about her patch when Major Daniel Brooks pulled him aside and said quietly and with genuine warmth, "Listen, Mercer, tomorrow's opening conference is going to have some senior officers in the room. Do yourself a favor and keep it professional." Tyler looked at him. "I'm always professional." Brooks studied him for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "that's what I'm afraid of." Tyler did not understand that comment for another 24 hours. The opening tactical conference was held in the main briefing room, and it was exactly the kind of gathering that Tyler loved. Enough people present that a good performance would be witnessed, and enough uncertainty in the room that someone with clear thinking could separate themselves from the crowd immediately. There were 83 pilots in that room: American, German, British, Norwegian, Italian, Dutch, senior officers and junior lieutenants, and everyone in between. The energy was the particular kind of controlled tension that exists when capable people are about to be put under serious pressure, and everyone present knows it. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Callahan stood at the front of the room without ceremony. She had not been introduced with a list of her accomplishments. She had simply walked to the front and begun speaking as if the introduction was unnecessary, which Tyler would later understand it absolutely was for everyone in that room except him. She talked about the exercise, about the simulated threat environment, about the ways that the opposing force would deliberately manipulate what pilots thought they were seeing. She used calm, precise language, and she said something that caught Tyler's attention immediately. A perfect sensor picture can still produce the wrong decision. She said if the pilot looking at it fails to understand the situation behind the data. She paused, letting that land. Modern aircraft systems give you remarkable information. They are not infallible, and they are not judgment. Your job is not to trust your display. Your job is to understand what your display is telling you and what it is not telling you and make a decision that accounts for both. Tyler sat forward slightly in his chair. He had heard this kind of talk before. The older pilots gave it fairly often, usually wrapped in some story about a time when they had survived something by relying on experience rather than equipment. It was the aviator version of, "We walked uphill both ways in the snow," a way of asserting that the generation before yours had something valuable that your generation was throwing away. Unrespected experience. He genuinely did, but he also believed in data, in measurement, in the reproducible, verifiable performance that numbers produced when you applied them correctly and without sentiment. And so when Rebecca finished her statement and opened the floor, Tyler raised his hand. "Ma'am," he said, "with respect, isn't there a risk that we're attaching more value to instinct than the evidence actually supports?" The room shifted. It was a small shift, almost imperceptible, but Tyler felt it, a subtle change in the air pressure of 83 people adjusting their attention simultaneously. Rebecca looked at him. Her expression did not change. "Go ahead, Lieutenant." "Aircraft systems are measurable," Tyler said. He kept his voice professional, even reasonable. He was not trying to be aggressive. He was trying to make a point. "They are consistent. When a pilot says they trusted their instinct, we have no way to replicate that, analyze it, or teach it. But when a pilot trusts the sensor suite and executes correctly, we can measure every variable, identify every error, and improve the process." Modern fifth-generation tactics are built on that foundation. And a pilot who fully integrates with the F-35's capabilities is always going to respond faster than someone filtering every cue through experience-based assumptions. He felt the room listening. He pressed on. "The aircraft's data fusion capability processes more information in 1 second than any human pilot can consciously absorb in a minute. That's not an argument against experience. It's an argument for using the technology correctly, trusting it, not second-guessing it with gut feelings that we can't verify." Major Brooks made a very quiet sound that Tyler interpreted as a sigh. He ignored it. Rebecca had not moved. She was still watching him with the same expression, calm, attentive, giving nothing away. "And your point, Lieutenant," she said, "is that a pilot who trusts the system completely will always perform better than a pilot who introduces personal judgment into the process." "My point," Tyler said, "is that instinct introduces uncertainty. Systems reduce it. And in combat, reducing uncertainty is how people survive." The room was fully silent now. Not the polite silence of people waiting for a speaker to finish. The weighted silence of people who understood something that Tyler did not. Rebecca let the quiet sit for a moment. Then she said, "What you're describing works exceptionally well when the information is accurate." "The system is designed to be accurate," Tyler said. "The system is designed to be accurate. When operating within its design parameters against threats it has been programmed to recognize," Rebecca said. "The enemy is also aware of those design parameters, which is why the first thing a sophisticated opponent does is attempt to operate outside them." Tyler opened his mouth. I had a response ready. He had spent enough time with these arguments, had rehearsed them enough in his own mind, that he could have continued for another 10 minutes without pause. But then Major Brooks said very quietly, "Mercer," and something in the Major's voice made Tyler pause. Rebecca was still watching him, still calm, still giving nothing away except an attention so precise and complete that it felt for just a moment like being looked at by someone who already knew exactly how this conversation ended. Tyler made a decision. Later, he would question whether it was courage or simply the inability to stop himself once he had committed to a direction. Ma'am, he said, I believe a pilot trained entirely in modern fifth-generation tactics who fully integrates with the aircraft's capabilities can defeat a pilot who relies primarily on experience and visual judgment. And I think the best way to settle that question is not theoretical. The silence in the room became a different thing entirely. It had weight now, mass. The kind of silence that happens right before something irreversible. Rebecca tilted her head slightly. Just slightly. Are you challenging my tactics, Lieutenant? She said. Or are you challenging me? Tyler heard his own pulse in his ears. He was aware of 82 other people in the room, all of them very still, all of them watching him with expressions ranging from astonished to deeply concerned to, in the case of the NATO contingent, something closer to dismay. I thought about Major Burt's warning. He thought about the faded gray patch on her shoulder. He thought about the way the conversations in the room had gone quiet when she walked past. He said, the best way to answer that question is in the air, ma'am. Nobody breathed. Rebecca looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that Tyler began to wonder whether she was going to simply end this with rank. Dismiss him, remove him from the exercise. Let him live with the embarrassment of having challenged a superior officer and been turned down flatly. Instead, she said, tomorrow morning, one-on-one engagement over the Nevada range. Training instrumentation only. No simulated long-range weapons. Victory requires visual identification and a valid weapons solution. She paused. Does that satisfy your terms, Lieutenant? Tyler nodded. Yes, ma'am. Good, Rebecca said. She turned back to the assembled pilots as if the previous 5 minutes had been a routine administrative discussion. Now, let's talk about the electromagnetic threat environment. The briefing continued. Tyler sat in his chair and felt the looks of the people around him as a kind of pressure against his skin. Not hostile exactly, but concerned in a way that was somehow worse than hostility. Several NATO pilots were looking at him the way people look at someone who has just stepped into a street without checking for traffic. Afterward, as the pilots filtered out of the room, a tall German officer with a wing commander's insignia stopped beside Tyler's chair. Lieutenant Mercer, the man said. Tyler looked up. My name is Weber, Lucas Weber. I fly with the German contingent. He paused and his voice was careful, not unfriendly, but precise, like a man choosing each word deliberately. You should know something before tomorrow. I appreciate it, sir, Tyler said, because he did. He was not stupid. He understood that he had done something significant in that room and that the landscape had shifted in ways he had not fully mapped yet. Weber looked towards the door through which Rebecca had already passed. Among NATO pilots, he said, Colonel Callahan is not called Ghost because she is difficult to find. Tyler waited. Weber looked back at him with an expression that Tyler would spend the next several months trying to accurately describe, and the closest he ever came was this. It was the expression of a man who had been very frightened once in a very specific place and had never fully put that fear down. She is called Ghost, Weber said, because enemy pilots often realize she was there only after everyone under her protection has already escaped. He held Tyler's eyes for a moment. Then he nodded once and walked away. Tyler sat with that for a long moment after the room had emptied. Then he went back to his quarters and did what he always did when he needed to understand an opponent. He pulled up every record he could find. Awards, deployments, commendations, mission reports. Most of them heavily redacted, large blocks of text blacked out with a thoroughness that told you something important had been removed without telling you anything about what it was. A service record that spanned 20 years and 4 continents and contained at its core an almost complete absence of the kind of visible heroism that made for good recruiting posters. No kill tallies, no accounts of famous engagements, nothing that translated into the kind of story that got told at squadron bars. Just an accumulation of time and place and redacted text in the faded gray patch with one word on it in the way 83 combat pilots had gone absolutely silent when she walked past them. Tyler built his tactical plan on the only conclusion that his data supported Rebecca Callahan's reputation was larger than her actual record. She was a symbol respected, even revered, but a symbol built on mystery rather than documented performance. She was the kind of officer that institutions needed. Reassuring, experienced, traditionally authoritative. And tomorrow he was going to prove in the most measurable way possible that the world had moved past what she represented. I was certain of this. He was certain the way that only a person who has never been completely wrong about something important can be certain with every cell in his body, with a conviction so total that the possibility of error existed only as an abstraction. I was 26 years old, and he had very fast hands, and he understood the F-35 better than most people understood their own native language. He had studied engagement theory, energy management, sensor integration. He had defeated pilots with 10 years more experience in controlled environments. He had never lost at anything that he truly believed mattered. He fell asleep planning how to win. 20 miles away in a different part of the base, Rebecca Callahan was also awake. But she was not planning how to win. She had already decided how the fight would go, not in the sense of predicting the outcome, but in the sense of understanding what she was trying to accomplish, which was something entirely different from defeating a young lieutenant in an air-to-air engagement. What she was doing was watching Tyler's flight tapes. All of them. Every controlled engagement, every simulator record, every piece of footage she had been able to obtain from his training pipeline. She watched with the particular quality of attention that she had developed over 2 decades, not looking for weakness exactly, but looking for the shape of the person inside the cockpit, the pattern underneath the performance. Tyler was exceptional. She recognized this immediately and without qualification. His reflexes were real. His processing speed was real. His understanding of the aircraft systems was genuinely impressive for someone his age. In controlled engagements where the information was accurate and the rules were clear, he was very good. Possibly great, but there was a pattern. She watched it repeat across tape after tape, engagement after engagement, and it was consistent enough that she could have set a clock by it. When the information became uncertain, when a contact dropped off the display, when a communication fragmented, when the tactical picture developed faster than his analytical framework could absorb, Tyler did not slow down and recalibrate. He accelerated. He attacked. He drove forward into the confusion with greater speed and greater aggression, as if force of will could resolve ambiguity the way processing power resolved computation. It worked often enough to have reinforced itself into habit. Against opponents who became uncertain and hesitated, Tyler's aggression was devastating. He was through their defenses before they finished deciding what to do. But it was not fearlessness. Rebecca had known fearless pilots. She had flown with them, and she had watched them die, and she understood what actual fearlessness looked like and what it cost. Tyler was not fearless. I was afraid of uncertainty, profoundly, specifically, almost viscerally afraid of not knowing what was happening. And when that fear arrived, he solved it the only way he had ever found effective, by attacking faster, harder, and more completely forcing the fight back into a structure where his advantages operated cleanly. She watched the last tape twice, noting the moment in each engagement where the shift occurred, the precise instant when ambiguity arrived and Tyler's whole tactical personality changed register. Then she closed the file and sat quietly for a moment. She did not feel triumph about tomorrow. She felt something closer to the specific weight of responsibility that comes with knowing you are about to teach someone something difficult that they genuinely need to learn, and that the teaching is going to hurt, and that you are going to have to be willing to let it hurt, because the alternative, letting them leave without the lesson, is far more dangerous. She thought about the NATO controller's voice on a radio years ago, in the dark above Eastern Europe. She thought about the one aircraft that had not come home. She turned off the light and lay in the dark for a while, not sleeping, just breathing, letting the weight of tomorrow settle into its proper place. She had agreed to fight him because punishment would not reach him. If she had shut him down with rank in that briefing room, Tyler Mercer would have sat in his chair, nodded at the appropriate moments, and walked out privately convinced that he was right, and that the institution had simply refused to let the question be tested honestly. He would have carried that conviction through his entire career, and eventually it would kill someone. Not necessarily him. Possibly his wingman. Possibly someone who trusted the wrong pilot at the wrong moment because the wrong pilot had never been genuinely challenged. Rebecca had spent 20 years learning that the most dangerous thing in any cockpit was not an enemy aircraft. It was unexamined certainty. And tomorrow morning over the Nevada desert, she was going to put Tyler Mercer directly inside the one environment where his certainty had never been properly tested. She was not going to humiliate him. She was going to educate him. And the most important part of the lesson had nothing to do with aircraft performance or weapons envelopes or sensor integration. It had to do with the moment when everything the pilot trusted stopped being reliable, and what kind of person they discovered themselves to be inside that moment. Outside the window, the Nevada desert was dark and enormous and patient. In a few hours, the sun would come up and two F-35As would climb into the air above it, and a young pilot with exceptional hands and a certainty that had never been truly tested would meet something that his display could not protect him from. Not an enemy, a mirror. He just did not know it yet. And somewhere down the hall in the room assigned to the NATO wing commander, Lucas Weber sat on the edge of his bunk and thought about a night above Eastern Europe when he had been certain he was going to die, and then had not because of a quiet woman in a damaged aircraft who had refused to leave him behind. He thought about the look on Tyler Mercer's face in the briefing room, the absolute unshakable confidence of someone who had never had that confidence genuinely tested. He recognized it. He had worn it himself once, a long time ago, before the ghosts. He hoped the morning would be kind to the young lieutenant. He hoped it would give him only what he needed and not more than he could carry. But he had been a pilot long enough to know that the morning made no promises. None of them did. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when Tyler climbed the ladder into his cockpit. His hands were steady, his breathing was controlled. He had slept 4 hours, which was more than enough. And he had eaten and he had gone through his pre-mission checks with the kind of methodical calm that his instructors had always praised. Everything about his external presentation said ready. Everything about his internal state said something considerably more complicated. He did not call it nerves. He would not have accepted that word. What he felt strapped into $80 million worth of fifth-generation fighter aircraft on a cold Nevada morning was a heightened state of awareness, the precise sharpening of attention that happened when something genuinely mattered. He had felt it before important simulator runs. He had felt it before his first solo flight. He had never felt it quite this specifically directed at another human being before. The operations center was already active. Telemetry stations were manned. More than 40 pilots from the American and NATO contingents had arrived before dawn to watch the feed, not because anyone had officially organized a viewing, but because word had spread the way. Word always spreads among combat pilots, which is to say immediately and completely. And by the time the sun came up, there was not an empty chair in the room. Tyler knew they were watching. He had factored it into his preparation. Oz ran his systems check on with quiet efficiency, cross-referencing each display, verifying sensor function, confirming his communications were clean. His aircraft was perfect. The F-35A was an extraordinary machine, and in that moment, sitting in its cockpit with the displays coming alive around him and the Nevada sky opening up above, Tyler felt the specific confidence of a man who believes that his tools are exceptional and that he knows how to use them better than anyone watching. His radio crackled. "Blaze, this is Ghost. Radio check." Her voice was calm, not warm, not cold, just clear and professional, the voice of a pilot running a standard pre-mission sequence. No theatrics, no acknowledgement of the strangeness of what they were about to do. Tyler keyed his microphone. "Ghost Blaze, Lima Charlie." Loud and clear. "Copy," Rebecca said. "Standard merge, equal energy, neutral starting position. Range safety officer has control. Follow his directions." "Copy," Tyler said. There was a brief pause, and then her voice came back one more time. "Blaze." "Ma'am, fly your airplane." The radio went quiet. Tyler stared at his display for a moment, parsing those 3 words. Fly your airplane. It was the most basic instruction in aviation, the thing instructors said to student pilots when they were overthinking, when their brains were running so fast that their hands started lagging behind. It was not a warning. It was not a threat. He could not decide whether it was advice or something else entirely. He taxied out and did not think about it anymore. They launched 2 minutes apart and joined at altitude over to the Nevada range, the range safety officer positioning them at identical energy states and identical altitudes, wings level, pointing at each other across 6 miles of desert air. The morning light was sharp and clean, and the sky was the specific shade of blue that exists only in high desert at altitude, and neither of them cared about any of it. Tyler watched the contact symbol on his display. He had already built his opening plan, a controlled initial turn, conservative energy management. Wait for Rebecca to commit to a direction, then exploit the geometry. He was not going to be aggressive at the merge. He was going to be patient. He was going to let his systems give him information and act on that information precisely and without hesitation. He believed this completely. The range safety officer transmitted the start signal. Tyler rolled his aircraft toward the fight. What happened in the next 90 seconds was not what Tyler had planned. He executed his opening turn correctly. His energy management was disciplined. He read Rebecca's initial move accurately and began repositioning to exploit the angle he expected her to create. She did not create it. She did something instead that Tyler's tactical planning had accounted for theoretically but had not fully prepared him for experientially. She refused his geometry entirely. She did not respond to his repositioning the way his model predicted. She changed her own geometry in a way that was simultaneously conservative and completely disorienting, because it meant that every calculation Tyler had made in the first 30 seconds was now wrong, and he was already committed to a position based on those calculations. He corrected quickly because his reflexes were real and the correction was genuine and fast. But this correction cost him energy, and energy cost him options, and when he looked at his display to reacquire her position, the contact symbol was not where he expected it to be. He found her visually, below his left shoulder, slightly aft, in a piece of sky that his display had shown as empty 15 seconds earlier. His stomach tightened. He rolled hard to deny her, the angle pulling significant G-force bleeding speed in exchange for nose position, trying to force the fight back into a geometry that his systems could track cleanly. For almost a full minute, he managed it. The observers in the operations center watched the telemetry and saw something that surprised most of them. Tyler was holding his own. Not just surviving, but genuinely contesting the engagement. Staying with a pilot who had been flying combat aircraft since before he had a driver's license, matching her through a demanding series of maneuvers that required both exceptional reflexes and disciplined energy management. Major Brooks watched the display and said nothing. Lucas Weber stood in the back of the room with his arms crossed and watched the telemetry with an expression that people who did not know him might have read as calm. People who knew him recognized it as something else, the careful stillness of a man waiting for the moment he already knew was coming. Then it happened. Rebecca made a subtle altitude change, subtle enough that Tyler's display processed it as a momentary sensor ambiguity, a brief discrepancy between the system's predicted position and the actual one. His display resolved the discrepancy within seconds, updating to show her corrected location. But in those seconds, Tyler had already made a decision. He had trusted the original projection and committed his nose to a position based on where the display said she should be, rather than where she actually was. By the time the display corrected, he had already moved through the geometry of a valid shot, already burned the angle he needed, already spent energy on a turn that took him in the wrong direction. It took Rebecca 4 more seconds after that. The training instrumentation registered a valid weapon solution on Tyler's aircraft, and the range safety officer called it out over the radio in a voice completely devoid of drama, because range safety officers are professionals, and professionals do not editorialize. Kill on blaze, reset. Tyler sat in his cockpit for one long breath. His hands were on the controls, and his display was showing him everything. Altitude, airspeed, fuel system status. Every variable perfectly quantified, and the display was telling him he had just been shot down by an aircraft that his systems had briefly, slightly, almost imperceptibly misrepresented. He keyed his radio. That contact had sensor displacement. I was tracking a ghost position. Rebecca's voice came back immediately. Quiet. Professional. Copy. Resetting. You'll have full telemetry review after. And then before Tyler could respond, do you want to continue? He understood what she was offering. An exit. Politely presented. No drama. He understood it and he dismissed it, and what he said was, reset, I'm ready. The second engagement was different in character from the first because Tyler was different. He had processed what happened rapidly, the way he processed everything, and concluded that his mistake had been allowing the contest to become a turning fight where small positioning errors compounded over time. He needed to change the game. He accelerated. When the range safety officer gave the signal, Tyler put his aircraft into a high-speed reposition. Not an energy-preserving tactical maneuver, but a deliberate attempt to change the entire nature of the fight, to move so quickly that Rebecca's ability to set up patient geometry would be disrupted to force the engagement into a realm where raw performance characteristics mattered more than subtle positioning. It was a legitimate tactic. In many engagements against many opponents, it would have worked. Rebecca did not chase him. This was the detail that Tyler had not fully accounted for, that there was a third option beyond fighting his geometry or fleeing it. She simply declined to follow. She used the terrain, the angle of the morning sun, and the specific interval of Tyler's repositioning to move into a piece of sky where he was not looking. She did not go where he expected her to go because she did not go where his model assumed any rational opponent would go. And Tyler's model, which was very good, was built on the behavior of opponents who operated within frameworks similar to his own. Rebecca did not. She had spent decades operating in environments where the standard frameworks were the first thing the enemy disrupted. She had learned through experience that no amount of simulator time could fully replicate to find the position that the other pilot's model had left empty. Not the position that made geometric sense, but the position that existed in the gap between what the other pilot's system showed and what was actually there. She was in that position when Tyler completed his reposition and turned back. He was still processing the geometry, still cross-checking his display, still reacquiring her contact symbol when his aircraft's training instrumentation registered a second valid weapon solution. Kill on blaze. Reset. The operations center was very quiet. Tyler's breathing, which he could hear in his own oxygen mask, had changed. It was still controlled. He was a trained pilot, and trained pilots control their breathing, but it had a different quality now. Faster, shallower, the physical signature of a nervous system encountering something it does not yet know how to categorize. He stared at his display for 3 full seconds before he keyed his radio. Reset, he said. I'm continuing. The third engagement was the one that the pilots watching the telemetry would talk about for years afterward. Not because of how it ended, the ending was actually the least dramatic part, but because of what happened in the 4 minutes before the end. Tyler came back changed, not humbled, not chastened, changed in the way that genuinely exceptional people change when they encounter something real that contradicts their model of the world, not by abandoning the model, but by attacking the problem harder, going deeper into their own capability to find the thing they had missed. He disabled several of his automated display assistance functions. He had decided with a logic that was actually reasonable, that if Rebecca was exploiting the gap between what his system showed and what was actually there, then the solution was to reduce his dependency on the systems and fly more directly to close the distance between his perception and reality by removing the intermediary. What happened next surprised everyone, including Rebecca. He was good. Not good in the way that simulator scores suggest good. Good in the way that only reveals itself under pressure, when the scaffolding of comfortable conditions is removed and what remains is something more fundamental. Tyler flew that third engagement with a rawness and a precision that did not look like the pilot from the first 2 exchanges. He made decisions faster. He adapted mid-maneuver. He read Rebecca's movements with something that was not quite experience, but was its younger cousin, an intuitive processing of pattern that his brain had been doing all along, that had simply been subordinated to his analytical framework until that framework temporarily got out of the way. For 4 minutes, he stayed with her through a sequence of maneuvers that had the NATO pilots in the operations center leaning forward in their chairs. Weber uncrossed his arms. Brooks had his hands flat on the table in front of him. And Rebecca, who had been a pilot for a very long time and had fought in conditions that these exercises were designed to approximate, found herself genuinely working. Not performing, working. The young lieutenant she had watched on flight tapes the night before, the one whose fear of uncertainty drove him into aggressive overextension, was doing something she had not predicted with certainty. He was adapting in real time. She noted it without changing her approach. She had expected his capability. What she had not predicted was the speed at which he could recalibrate when the conditions demanded it. That was worth knowing. But then, and this was the moment Weber had been waiting for, Tyler saw an opening. It was a real opening. Rebecca had committed to a position that created a momentary vulnerability, a brief window where his nose was in the right place and her defensive options were limited. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that his training had conditioned him to exploit without hesitation. He went for it. Completely, fully, With every bit of the aggressive energy he had been managing and restraining for the previous 4 minutes, all of it, at once in pursuit of a weapon solution that was genuinely within reach. He almost got it. Almost. But in committing to the kill, he stopped monitoring everything else. His fuel state, which had been decreasing throughout a demanding engagement, had crossed a threshold that a flight lead needed to respect. His altitude bled away through the maneuvers was lower than the training range protocols preferred. His escape options, if Rebecca reversed on him, were narrowing. He did not notice any of this. He noticed only the kill. Rebecca noticed everything. She also noticed the exact moment when Tyler's display, tracking a position she had briefly occupied, failed to update fast enough to catch her next movement, and she used that interval, 2 seconds, maybe 3, to reposition into the geometry that ended the fight. Kill on blaze. Silence. Tyler sat in his cockpit with his hands still on the controls, his display showing a situation that had been resolved against him 3 consecutive times by a pilot whose methods he had publicly criticized in front of 83 people. He was very quiet for a long time. Then he called the bingo fuel state that ended the engagement and turned back toward Nellis without another word on the radio. The operations center was silent as the telemetry tracks converged toward the airfield. Nobody said anything that would be repeated later. Some of the NATO pilots exchanged looks. Brooks watched the screen with an expression that was not satisfaction and was not relief, and was something much more complicated than either the expression of a man who had hoped for a particular outcome without being certain it would arrive and was now processing the fact that it had. Weber left the room before anyone else. He walked to the flight line and stood in the early morning sun and waited. He had done the same thing years ago in a different country in different light. He had waited on a different ramp for aircraft that his instruments had already declared lost. They had come home then. He expected this one would too. Tyler landed first. He taxied in with the precise efficiency of someone managing a very large amount of internal information and not allowing any of it to surface visibly. He shut down his aircraft, completed his post-flight, and climbed down from the cockpit with the controlled movements of someone who had decided not to show anything to anyone. He turned around and saw the ground crews, the crew chief, 2 mechanics, all 3 of them carefully not looking at him, which was its own kind of communication. And then he saw the pilots gathered near the hangar entrance. Not a crowd, not a spectacle, just pilots standing in the way pilots stand when something significant has happened, and they are waiting to see how the person it happened to is going to carry themselves. Tyler looked at them. He did not say anything. He nodded once, a single tight nod that meant, "I know what you saw, and I am still here." And then he walked toward the debrief building with his helmet bag over his shoulder and his back straight, and his hands, which were slightly unsteady, tucked inside the helmet bag where nobody could see them. Rebecca landed 4 minutes later. She climbed down from her aircraft and said something brief and quiet to her crew chief, who nodded and began the post-flight inspection. Then she walked toward the debrief building without looking at the gathered pilots, without adjusting her pace, without any external acknowledgement that the morning had been anything other than a routine training event. The formal debrief was not what anyone expected. The room had been arranged with the same professional neutrality that Nellis maintained for all post-mission reviews. Tyler sat in the front row. NATO pilots filled the seats behind him. Brooks sat to the side. Weber had come in late and taken a position near the back wall standing. Rebecca began with the tactical points. Systems issues, engagement geometry, energy management decisions. She was precise and organized, and she went through the engagement analysis the way a good instructor goes through it factually without editorializing, identifying what occurred and what the data showed. She did not use Tyler's name more than necessary. She referred to engagements 1, 2, and 3. She described decisions and outcomes without attaching drama to either. And then she said something that nobody in the room had predicted. "I want to acknowledge Lieutenant Mercer's performance in the 3rd engagement specifically," she said. "The tactical adaptation he demonstrated in that exchange was genuine and significant. He made real-time adjustments under pressure that most pilots his age cannot execute. That capability is real, and it matters, and it should be recognized." Silence. Tyler did not move. Rebecca continued, "I also want to take responsibility for something. I did not explain the purpose of this exercise clearly enough in yesterday's conference. I described a philosophy without adequately connecting it to the conditions these engagements were designed to create. That is a failure of instruction, and it is mine. Now the silence had a different texture. Something shifted in it, a collective recalibration, the almost audible sound of 80 pilots revising their interpretation of what they were witnessing. Rebecca looked at Tyler directly for the first time during the debrief. "Lieutenant Mercer, please stay behind after dismissal." The debrief ended. The room emptied. Brooks left last, pausing near the door for just a moment, not to say anything. Just to exist in the doorway briefly in the way that people do when they want to communicate something without words. Then he was gone. The room was empty except for 2 pilots. Tyler stood with his helmet bag at his feet, looking at a wall display that still showed the telemetry from the morning's engagements. 3 sets of tracks, 3 clean geometric illustrations of what had happened and when. Rebecca sat at the edge of the table and said nothing for a moment. She let the quiet exist without filling it. Then she said, "Sit down, Lieutenant." He sat. "Your aircraft gives you information," she said, "not judgment. Jenna, you understand the difference?" Tyler looked at the wall display. "I made decisions based on what my display showed me." "You made decisions based on what your display showed you without sufficiently accounting for the gap between the display and reality," Rebecca said. "Those are not the same thing. Your system processes sensor data and presents it as a picture. That picture is not the reality. It is a representation of the reality filtered through processing algorithms constrained by sensor geometry and subject to latency. The gap is small, but the gap is real. And against an opponent who understands that gap, the gap is everything." Tyler was quiet for a moment. "I adapted in the 3rd engagement." "You did," she said. "Genuinely, you removed several automated aids and flew more directly. And for 4 minutes, you were better than I expected. That was real." She paused. "And then you saw what looked like a kill and you chased it completely." Tyler said nothing. "At the point where you committed to the 3rd weapon solution," Rebecca said, "your fuel state had crossed a threshold. Your altitude had decreased to a level that reduced your options. In a training environment, those were recoverable problems. In a real environment with a real opponent, with real terrain, that chase is the last decision you make." Tyler felt something shift in his chest, not defensiveness, something quieter and colder than defensiveness. The specific discomfort of understanding that a criticism is accurate. "I would have had the shot," he said. "Possibly," Rebecca agreed, "and your wingman would have been alone at low altitude with a hostile aircraft that had just watched you commit everything to a kill." She let that sit for a moment. "The mission was one-on-one, I understand that. But I need you to understand something that no simulator has taught you yet." She looked at him directly. "No combat mission is one-on-one. Even when you are alone in the cockpit, someone else is depending on your decisions." Tyler stared at the telemetry display. He stared at the tracks, his aircraft and Rebecca's intersecting and diverging and intersecting again across 3 engagements. The geometry of the morning laid out in clean lines against a white background. He wanted to argue. He felt the argument forming the logical, data-supported, technically accurate argument that in a one-on-one training engagement, the metric for success was winning the engagement, and that any decision made in pursuit of that objective was within the stated parameters of the exercise. He got as far as opening his mouth, and then he closed it. Because somewhere under the argument, in a quieter place that the argument had always drowned out before something was answering it, and the answer was not a counter-argument, it was a question. What if there had been a wingman? He sat with that question for a long time. Rebecca did not rush him. She sat at the edge of the table and let him sit with it because she had been a pilot long enough to know the precise value of the moment when someone begins to genuinely question something they were previously certain about, and she knew that rushing it helped nobody. Finally, Tyler said, "What are you going to do with me?" Rebecca looked at him with something that was not quite surprise and was not quite amusement and was definitely not sympathy in any conventional sense. "I'm going to make you useful," she said. He did not know what that meant yet. He found out the following morning when the assignment board showed his name, paired with Lieutenant Noah Bennett's for the exercises training package. Noah was a solid pilot, steady, conscientious, the kind of aviator who never made spectacular mistakes and never produced spectacular results. He was respected without being celebrated, which in most squadrons was its own kind of invisibility. Tyler stared at the board for a long moment. Behind him, a pilot from the Norwegian contingent murmured something to his partner that Tyler did not hear clearly. What he heard clearly was the quiet sound of both of them understanding something that he did not. Understood it as a demotion, a reassignment designed to keep him occupied and visible and managed while the actual exercise unfolded around him. He understood it as Rebecca using her rank to do what she had not done in the briefing room to quiet him, contain him, limit the damage he might do. He was wrong about this. He did not know he was wrong yet. What he knew was that he was angry, and that the anger was the clean, energizing kind, that he was comfortable with, the kind that he had always been able to direct and use. He went to his first planning session with Noah, feeling the sharp edge of that anger, and deciding to use it to be the best wingman the training program had ever documented, so that when this assignment ended, and it would end, nobody could say he had wasted the time. Noah met him in the planning room with a quiet handshake and the particular careful neutrality of a pilot who understood exactly the situation he was in and was choosing not to make it more complicated. "Good morning, Lieutenant," Tyler said. "Morning," Noah said. He looked at Tyler for a moment with steady brown eyes that communicated something patient and uncomplicated. "I know this isn't your preferred assignment." Tyler started to say something professional and deflecting. Noah stopped him. "It's fine," he said. "I'm not going to pretend it's something it isn't. You're here, I'm here, we have a job. Let's do the job." Tyler looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "All right," and they went to work. The first training flights were demanding in ways Tyler had not anticipated. Not demanding because the objectives were complex. They were not by his standards, particularly complex, but demanding because Rebecca had begun removing the comfortable certainties one by one with a patience and a precision that made him feel like he was being slowly, methodically disassembled. Communications degraded in ways that required decisions without complete information. Radar contacts conflicted with each other in patterns that required him to decide which one to trust and which one to question. A simulated sensor failure arrived during an approach sequence, requiring him to adapt his procedures in real time. Weather appeared unexpectedly. Fuel restrictions tightened the margins on decisions he would normally have made with room to spare. He handled most of it. The ones he did not handle cleanly were educational in the specific way that Rebecca seemed to engineer everything, not humiliating but precise. Each gap in his performance corresponded to a principle she would articulate later quietly and without drama in a review that was more conversation than critique. "You prioritize the objective over the wingman," she said after one mission, pointing at a decision Tyler had made when a simulated threat presented him with a choice between completing his tasking and covering Noah's 6 o'clock. In this environment, that choice cost you a simulated wingman. In a real environment, it cost you a real person. How do you value that trade? Tyler had not had a clean answer. The objective was achievable, he said. Noah was in a defensive position, but not a critical one. "How do you know?" Rebecca said. "My displays showed." "Your display showed you what the sensors could see," she said. "Noah is also telling you information, his voice, his radio calls, his positioning. Did you hear any of those?" Tyler thought about the mission. He thought about Noah's voice on the radio, and he realized with a specific unpleasant clarity that he had stopped processing Noah's voice as information about 20 seconds before the moment Rebecca was identifying. He had classified Noah as managed and turned his full attention to the objective. He had stopped listening. The recognition of this was not pleasant. It was not the clean, energizing anger he was accustomed to. It was something smaller and more uncomfortable, the particular discomfort of understanding that a capability he believed he had was operating at a lower level than he had assessed. That evening, he found Weber near the flight line running through his own post-mission notes, and he sat down next to him without being invited and said, "Tell me about the mission." Weber looked up. "The one that gave her the call sign," Tyler said. "You were there." Weber closed his notebook. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the runway with the expression of someone choosing how much of a real story to give a person who is asking for the first time. Finally, he said, "You want the version that makes her sound impressive, or you want the version that explains why I still think about it?" "The second one," Tyler said. Weber nodded slowly. He looked at the runway for another moment. Then he began to talk. And Tyler listened in a way he had not listened to anyone in a very long time, without preparing his response, without evaluating the information against his existing model, without looking for the gap in the argument or the place where his data contradicted the narrative. Just listening, it was harder than he expected. And when Weber finished, when the story ended, not with triumph, but with the weight of the one aircraft that had not come home, and the look on Weber's face that went with that ending, Tyler sat in the growing dark of the Nevada evening and understood for the first time that Rebecca's reputation was not built on mystery, it was built on cost. And that the cost was something she carried specifically and daily in a way that had nothing to do with glory or legend or the story NATO pilots told each other. He thought about the faded patch on her shoulder. Ghost. He thought about what Weber had said in the briefing room, that enemy pilots realized she was there only after everyone under her protection had already escaped. He had heard that as a description of tactical skill, a combat technique, a way of fighting that produced a particular outcome. He understood now that it was something else entirely. It was a description of a choice, repeated daily in every flight, in every briefing, and every moment when the option to pursue personal advantage existed and was declined. The choice to be the thing that other people could navigate by. Not the most visible point in the sky, not the highest scorer, not the pilot with the most confirmed kills, or the most decorated record, or the most impressive performance in a controlled engagement. The fixed reference, the reliable point, the thing that other people could find when they could not find anything else. He had spent his entire career trying to be the best pilot in the sky. He had never once considered what it might mean to be the one that people could find when the sky stopped making sense. The realization arrived without drama, not as a thunderclap or a sudden epiphany, but as the quiet, uncomfortable settling of something true into a space that had previously been occupied by something that was not. He sat with it for a long time after Weber went back to his quarters. The Nevada night was enormous around him. The runway lights were steady and patient. Somewhere above them, the red flag exercise was continuing in the morning sky, and 60 aircraft were navigating a simulated war, and one woman in a damaged formation was choosing again and again the position that kept everyone else oriented. Tyler looked up at the sky. He thought about what Rebecca had said in the debrief: even when you are alone in the cockpit, someone else is depending on your decisions. He had argued with it. He did not argue with it anymore. The morning of the main red flag mission arrived the way serious things always arrive, without fanfare, without ceremony, without any external signal that today was going to be different from the days before it. The pilots ate breakfast at the same tables, drank the same coffee, ran the same pre-mission checklist. The briefing room had the same fluorescent lights and the same smell of recycled air and dry erase markers. Everything looked identical to every other morning that week. But something was different in the room, and every pilot there could feel it without being able to precisely name it. It was the difference between a training exercise and the real exercise, the one that everyone had been building toward, the one that would count, the one where the performance would be observed and evaluated and remembered. 60-plus aircraft, American and NATO pilots, a strike package of genuine complexity running across the full Nevada range. An opposing force that had spent the previous week specifically studying how the Blue Air Formation operated so they could dismantle it. Rebecca stood at the front of the briefing room and went through the package with the same controlled precision she brought to everything. Strike timeline, electronic threat environment, coordination windows, contingency plans. She had built the mission architecture herself, and she presented it in a way that was organized without being rigid. She left space in her instructions for the thing that always happened in real operations, which was that the plan would survive contact with reality for approximately the first 4 minutes before requiring adaptation. Tyler sat in the second row between Noah and a Norwegian pilot named Eriksson, who had barely spoken 10 words to him all week and who Tyler had privately begun to respect enormously for this quality. Noah had his notebook out and was writing in the careful, organized handwriting of someone who understood that what gets written in briefings is what gets remembered when the radio stops working. Rebecca reached the formation assignments. She read them out without inflection, the way she read everything as fact, not as drama. Mercer and Bennett, 4-ship section, Eastern Corridor, Mercer on Bennett's wing. Tyler noted it. He had expected it. 3 days of flying wing on Noah had not changed the assignment, which he had stopped thinking of as a demotion approximately 48 hours earlier, when something Rebecca said in a post-mission review had reorganized his understanding of what the assignment actually was. She had told him very simply, a pilot who can lead is common. A pilot who can be led, who can support someone else's decision-making under pressure without taking the decision away from them, is considerably rarer. Both matter. You have only developed one. He had sat with that for 2 days. He was still sitting with it. The formation launched before full sunrise. The aircraft climbing out of Nellis in sequence with the kind of professional efficiency that results from genuine preparation rather than performed confidence. Tyler took his position on Noah's wing and ran his systems checks and cross-referenced his displays and did everything exactly the way it was supposed to be done. And for the first 10 minutes of the ingress, he felt the clean, focused calm of a pilot who is prepared thoroughly and knows it. Then the electronic environment started. It started subtly, which Rebecca had warned them it would. A contact that appeared on the eastern scope at a range that did not quite match the timeline. A communications window that clipped slightly, dropping the last word of a range controller's transmission. A fuel computation that updated 2 seconds later than expected. None of these were individually alarming. Each one had a reasonable explanation. A training pilot who trusted his systems would have categorized each anomaly, noted it, and continued. Tyler categorized each anomaly, noted it, and held the pattern. This was new. 3 weeks ago, even 2 weeks ago, his response to the first anomaly would have been to update his mental picture and drive forward harder. Now he did something different. He compared the anomaly to the mission timeline, to his fuel, to the behavior of the contact in relation to the geography below him, to the rate at which the discrepancies were accumulating. The discrepancies were accumulating at a rate that was not random. Noah, he said on their internal frequency, his voice level. Eastern contact, check your scope against mission timeline. There was a brief pause. Noah's voice came back careful and precise. Contact is 14 seconds early. Range doesn't match the predicted ingress for the threat timeline. Copy, Tyler said. Don't pursue. Another pause. You think it's a decoy? I think it's exactly what we were briefed to expect, Tyler said. I think they want us to turn east. Noah processed this for a moment. Ghost, this is Bennett. Eastern contact assessment, possible decoy. Mercer concurs, requesting guidance. Rebecca's voice came back almost immediately, and what she said was not instruction or confirmation. What she said was 3 words, your call, Bennett. Noah looked at the contact for another 4 seconds. Then he held his heading and said, continuing mission profile, Eastern contact is not pursued. 30 seconds later, the contact disappeared from their scopes, entirely revealing itself as precisely what Tyler had suspected, a false track generated by the opposing forces' electronic warfare package, designed to pull the eastern section out of position and isolate them from the main strike package. Good call, Rebecca said on the package frequency. Just that. 2 words, flat and professional. Tyler heard something in those 2 words that he would not have heard 3 weeks ago. Not praise. Something more useful than praise, acknowledgement that the process had worked, that the judgment had been sound, that the decision had been made correctly and for the right reasons. He settled back into his position on Noah's wing and felt something settle inside him as well. Then 40 minutes into the mission, everything changed. Noah's voice came across the internal frequency, and the change in it was immediate and unmistakable to anyone who had been listening to another human being's voice long enough to hear what was underneath the words. Blaze, I've got a flight control caution. Left system. Tyler was already looking at Noah's aircraft. Copy, what's the display showing? Caution light, electrical. A brief pause. Display just flickered. Tyler felt the first cold edge of something that was not quite alarm, not yet, but was its immediate predecessor. A sensor anomaly was one thing. A flight control caution combined with electrical issues in a formation of aircraft running a complex mission in a degraded electronic environment was something categorically different. Noah, talk to me. Is the caution steady or intermittent? Intermittent. A short gap in Noah's transmission. It reset. Display came back. Now it's showing different altitude than before the reset. That was the moment. That specific detail, the altitude disagreement post-reset, was the detail that told Tyler this was not a minor anomaly to be managed and continued. This was a real problem. Ghost Blaze, he transmitted. Bennett has electrical malfunction with display discrepancy post-reset, requesting exercise termination for his section. Rebecca's response came back within seconds, and her voice was the same as it always was, controlled, clear, completely, without the quality of someone who has been surprised. But Tyler heard something underneath it that he had not heard from her before. Not concern exactly. Something more alert than concern. The specific attention of someone who is instantly calculating a situation that requires simultaneous management of multiple competing priorities. Copy Blaze. Exercise termination granted for Bennett. Range control is directing you to recovery route Alpha. Maintain formation. Range control came up on the frequency with the recovery routing, and Tyler cross-checked it against his own display and his own fuel and his own understanding of the terrain, and everything about the recovery route looked manageable for about 30 seconds. Then Noah said, "Blaze, I've got conflicting navigation now. My system is disagreeing with range control's routing." Tyler looked at his own display. His navigation was clean. "Noah, my nav is good. What's yours showing?" "Different heading to the recovery point. About 20 degrees off." Another pause. More labored breathing now. Not panic, not yet, but the breathing of someone whose nervous system was beginning to accumulate threat signals faster than it could process them. Which one do I follow? This was the moment that Rebecca had been building toward for 3 weeks without Tyler knowing it. Not this specific moment. She had not predicted a genuine electrical malfunction in Noah's aircraft, because reality does not take requests. But this category of moment, this specific type of situation, a pilot with compromised systems who could not determine which information was reliable, a wingman who needed to make decisions based on trust rather than data, a recovery route that looked straightforward on paper and required judgment to execute safely, and Tyler, his wingman's only reliable reference, having to choose what kind of pilot he was going to be in the next several minutes. "Noah, follow my heading," Tyler said. "Fly on my wing. Ignore your nav until we sort out which system is reliable." "Copy." Noah's voice was tighter now. The effort of maintaining professional control was audible in the spaces between his words. "Blaze, I need to tell you, my altitude indicator just went split. 2 different readings." Tyler processed this with a speed and completeness that surprised even himself. 2 conflicting altitude readings in a pilot who was already disoriented by navigation disagreements and electrical cautions. The official recovery route Alpha ran through terrain. If Noah did not know his accurate altitude terrain was not a route, it was a threat. "Ghost Blaze," Tyler transmitted, and his voice was steady, and he was privately aware of how much effort that steadiness was requiring, because his hands on the controls were not quite as steady as his voice. "Bennett has dual altitude indicator disagreement. Recovery route Alpha requires terrain navigation, requesting alternate routing or tanker support." Rebecca's response was not immediate this time. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 7. When she came back, something had changed in her voice, not in its steadiness, which was absolute and unchanged, but in its quality. The particular quality of a commander managing multiple simultaneous problems, each of which would be significant individually and which together required rapid sequential prioritization. "Blaze tanker is unable to descend through the turbulent layer. Alternate route Bravo adds significant distance. Your fuel state won't support Bravo," and a divert. A pause of exactly 2 seconds. "You have the information. Make the call." Tyler heard those 4 words and understood what they meant and what they cost Rebecca to say them, which was everything, because saying "make the call" to a wingman who was flying his first real emergency was Rebecca transferring authority over Noah's life to a pilot she had known for 3 weeks and had spent those 3 weeks specifically methodically challenging. It was the most complete statement of trust Tyler had ever received. He was terrified. He looked at his fuel. He looked at his nav display, which was reliable and clear. He looked at Noah's aircraft flying 200 feet off his left wing, slightly unsteady, the inputs of a pilot managing both the aircraft and a growing internal storm of disorientation and anxiety. He looked at the terrain ahead. He looked at the cloud base. He looked at the way the western cloud edge had been moving for the last 10 minutes. He did not trust his instinct. He would not have framed it that way. He still did not fully trust the word, but he did something that 3 weeks ago he would have considered irrational. He weighted the real-time data. He was personally observing the cloud movement, The terrain profile, the quality of Noah's current formation, flying the fuel arithmetic against the algorithmic recommendation of his navigation system, and he found the real-time data more current, more specific, and more relevant to the actual decision. The data recommended the climb to avoid terrain. Tyler chose the terrain route. Ghost Blaze, we're taking Road Alpha. I'll keep Bennett in close formation visual. He will navigate by my aircraft. He paused. My assessment cloud base is lifting on the western edge. Alpha reduces distance and fuel burn. Emergency runway at the end has a resting gear. Another pause. I am not guessing. This is what I see. Another silence from Rebecca. Longer this time, long enough that Tyler counted it. 4 seconds. 5. Copy Blaze, she said. Route Alpha approved. Keep him on your wing. Tyler took one full breath. Then he moved his aircraft to Noah's left side, positioning himself close enough that Noah could see every detail of his wings and every movement of his control surfaces. Close enough that if Noah's remaining instruments failed completely, he could his aircraft by visual reference alone. Noah, Tyler said on the internal frequency, look at me. There was a brief pause. I'm looking. Don't look at your instruments. Don't look at the ground. Don't look at the clouds. Look at my aircraft. Match my bank. Match my nose position. Follow my power changes. That's the only job you have right now. Noah's voice was quieter when he answered. The specific quiet of someone who has decided to surrender a particular kind of control. Copy. Good, Tyler said. We're going home the short way. You are going to be fine. But I need you to stop thinking about your instruments and start trusting my aircraft. Can you do that? A pause. Then, yes. Good, Tyler said again, and he meant it. They entered the terrain route with Tyler flying the most demanding formation position he had ever held in a non-simulated environment, close enough to provide Noah with a clear visual reference, far enough to maintain safe separation through the turbulence that jolted both aircraft periodically, constantly adjusting his own positioning to give Noah the best possible sight picture for following. I was simultaneously monitoring his own fuel, his own navigation, the terrain on his display, Rebecca's position 40 miles northeast, where she was managing the rest of the formation through the final strike phase, and Noah's voice on the internal frequency, which had become Tyler's most important instrument. Not his displays, Noah's voice. The quality of it, the breathing behind it, the speed of the responses, the specific way Noah said copy when he meant he was managing, and the slightly different way he said it when he was beginning to lose altitude in the processing chain. 3 weeks ago, Tyler would not have known the difference. Now he heard it immediately and instinctively, and he responded to it not with more information, but with a steadier presence, adjusting his position, slightly making his control. Inputs more visible, modulating his voice on the radio to a frequency and pace that was easier to anchor to. He became a fixed point. He did not think of it that way in the moment. He was too busy flying, but that was what he was doing, and some part of him recognized it, the part that had listened to Weber's story in the Nevada dark, that had processed what Rebecca had said about being the reliable reference that people navigate by when the sky stops making sense. He was doing that now, not because he had decided to, because when the moment came, it turned out to be the only thing that made sense to do. 22 minutes into the recovery, Noah's remaining display systems began failing in sequence. Airspeed went unreliable first. Then altitude. Navigation had been questionable since the initial malfunction. The flight control caution had been steady for 12 minutes. Blaze, Noah said, and his voice had a quality in it that Tyler had not heard before. Not panic, but the edge of it, the place just before panic where a person is still thinking, but is aware that thinking is becoming harder. I've got almost nothing left on the display. I know, Tyler said. You don't need it. My airspeed. Watch my throttle position, Tyler said. When I move it forward, move yours forward. When I pull it back, pull yours back. Match me. Don't look at numbers. Match me. A silence, then copy. Good, Tyler said. And then because he understood what Noah needed in this moment, not more instruction, not more information, but something human and steady and real, he said, you are doing exactly right. You have been doing exactly right for the last 20 minutes. We are 4 minutes from the runway. Noah's breathing on the radio changed slightly. 4 minutes, Noah said. 4 minutes, Tyler confirmed. Rebecca came up on the frequency then, and her voice had a quality Tyler recognized from the morning of their engagement 3 weeks earlier, the precise, complete attention of someone who had done her own calculations and was now giving the outcome of those calculations to someone she trusted with it. Blaze, be advised, Bennett's fuel is decreasing faster than projected. Possible fuel system involvement in the electrical fault. A pause. He may have one approach opportunity. Tyler heard this and said nothing for 3 seconds because 3 seconds was what it took to process the information and integrate it and decide what to do with it. One approach opportunity meant no go-around, no second chance if the first approach did not work. Noah would have to land on the first attempt or he would run out of fuel before he could try again. Copy, Tyler said. I'll walk him down. Rebecca said, this is your wingman Blaze, bring him home. She did not say it dramatically. She said it the way she said everything as fact, as the clear, simple statement of what was true. And what was true was exactly what she had said. Noah was Tyler's responsibility, not range controls, not Rebecca's, Tyler's. He accepted it completely and without hesitation, and the completeness and lack of hesitation surprised him. He turned to Noah's frequency. Noah, we are going to do this one time and we are going to do it right. I'm going to talk you through every step. Your job is to keep your eyes on my aircraft and answer me when I talk to you. Nothing else. Can you do that? Yes, Noah said. His voice was steadier than Tyler expected. The steadiness of someone who has decided to trust completely. They began the approach. Tyler talked him through it in the specific plain language that Rebecca had used with Tyler in their debriefs, not technical, not loaded with procedure, numbers, and checklist references, but human language, descriptive language, the kind of language that a person can follow when their cognitive load is already at its ceiling. We're turning now. Match my bank. Good. Power coming back slightly. Match me. Good. You're doing well, Noah. Exactly right. He described the turn. He described the power reduction. He described the moment when the runway should appear in Noah's windscreen and what it would look like and where Noah should aim his eyes. He talked to Noah the way someone talks to a person who is frightened and trying and doing better than they think they are. I can see the runway, Noah said. His voice had the specific quality of someone reporting something miraculous. I know, Tyler said. You're lined up. Good. Keep coming. Match my power. Gear should be down. Do you have 3 green APAWs? I have 2 green and 1 amber. Tyler processed this instantly. Possible gear indication issue from the electrical fault. Could be a false indication from the degraded electrical system, or could be a genuine gear problem. No way to verify from outside the aircraft in current conditions. He made the call immediately. Noah, the arresting cable is at the far end of the runway. Plan to engage it. Even if your gear is good, you are going to land and engage that cable. Do you understand? Copy, Noah said. The cable will stop you. That is what it is for. Trust it. Copy. Tyler moved his aircraft above and slightly ahead of Noah's, watching the approach. Angle, watching Noah's sink rate, watching the way the aircraft was tracking relative to the runway threshold. He talked continuously, not because Noah needed every word, but because Noah needed the voice. The steady, present, uninterrupted voice that told him he was not alone and that the person he was following had not left. The aircraft crossed the threshold. Tyler said, power to idle, nose down slightly, hold the wings level. The cable is 50 meters ahead of you. Noah's aircraft touched the runway with a contact that was harder than ideal and less than catastrophic. The landing of a pilot who had done everything right under conditions where right was nearly impossible to define. The arresting cable caught. The aircraft decelerated in the sharp, definitive way that arresting gear decelerates aircraft, not gradual but absolute. A full stop in a distance that felt incompatible with the speed that had just existed. Tyler flew the overhead and landed on his own approach, and when his aircraft rolled out and he brought the throttle to idle and felt the aircraft settle, he became aware for the first time of something he had not had attention to spare for in the previous 30 minutes. His hands were shaking, not slightly, genuinely shaking, a fine continuous tremor in both hands that had absolutely nothing to do with the aircraft's vibration and everything to do with the accumulated physiological cost of the previous half hour. The cost of flying close formation through turbulence while managing a disoriented wingman, while making sequential high-stakes decisions, while talking someone through an approach on one attempt, while the fuel clock ran and the options narrowed, and the voice on the internal frequency got quieter and more trusting and more dependent with every mile. He sat in his cockpit after shutdown and looked at his hands and did not try to make them stop. He just let them shake for a moment because his wingman was on the ground. His wingman was on the ground, safe, and the arresting cable had caught, and the medical team was already at the aircraft, and somewhere 40 miles north, the rest of the formation was completing the strike package under Rebecca's command. And Tyler Mercer, who 3 weeks ago had stood in a briefing room in front of 83 combat pilots and declared that modern systems had made human judgment obsolete, had just spent 30 minutes being a fixed point in someone else's sky. Not the most decorated pilot, not the highest scorer, not the fastest processor of tactical information. Just a steady voice and a pair of wings that someone could follow when everything else went dark. He climbed down from his aircraft and found the ground crew chief looking at him with an expression that Tyler could not fully interpret and did not try to. And he said very quietly, "How's Bennett?" "Medical team has him, sir. He's talking." Looked shaken, but okay. Tyler nodded. He walked toward Noah's aircraft where the medical team was completing their evaluation. Noah was standing beside the aircraft with a thermal blanket around his shoulders, standard post-incident procedure, and his color was not good, but his eyes were clear. And when he saw Tyler walking toward him, something crossed his face that Tyler had no word for and did not need one. "Hey," Noah said. "Hey," Tyler said. Noah looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "You didn't leave." Tyler looked at him. 3 weeks ago, he would not have understood what those 3 words meant as a statement about aviation, about leadership, about the thing that Rebecca had been trying to teach him since the morning he stood up in a briefing room and challenged her publicly. 3 weeks ago, he would have heard "you didn't leave" as a simple, factual observation. The wingman stayed with the damaged aircraft, standard procedure. Now he understood it as something else. "You didn't leave" was Noah saying, "I was afraid you would make a different calculation, and I was afraid the calculation would be correct, and I was afraid I was going to be alone in a damaged aircraft with a failing display and rising terrain and one approach opportunity, and I was afraid, and you didn't leave." Tyler looked at his wingman for a moment, then he said simply no. He walked back toward the squadron building with his helmet bag over his shoulder, and his hands were still trembling, and he did not try to hide it, and nobody who saw him tried to pretend they did not notice. Rebecca arrived 40 minutes later after the full strike package had been recovered and accounted for. She climbed down from her aircraft with the same unhurried efficiency she brought to everything, spoke briefly with her crew chief, and then walked directly to the medical area where Noah had been moved for evaluation. She spent 5 minutes with Noah, 5 full minutes, which in the economy of Rebecca Callahan's operational day was a significant investment, and what she did in those 5 minutes was not debrief him, not evaluate his performance, not ask him to account for his aircraft handling or his decision-making during the emergency. She asked how he was doing, and she listened to his answer. When she came out of the medical area, she found Tyler standing near the entrance because he had not been willing to go further than that until he knew Noah's status was confirmed stable. Rebecca stopped in front of him. The ground crews were working around them. Pilots from the recovered formation were moving past. The business of a large exercise post-mission was happening in every direction. Rebecca looked at Tyler with the specific, complete attention she brought to everything, and she said, "You finally stopped trying to prove you were the best pilot in the sky." Tyler looked at her. He felt the truth of it and the weight of it, and the particular exhaustion that comes after the first time a person does something genuinely hard that matters genuinely. He looked at the ground for a moment. Rebecca's voice when she continued was quiet enough that only he could hear it, and it had something in it that he had never heard from her before. Not warmth exactly, she was not a warm person in the conventional sense. Something more precise than warmth. Something that recognized what he had done and weighted it accurately and gave it its correct value without reducing it to sentiment. She said, "And that is when you became one." Tyler kept his eyes on the ground for another moment. I thought about Noah's voice on the radio saying "you didn't leave." He thought about Rebecca saying "make the call," trusting him with the most serious thing she could trust anyone with. He thought about Weber's story in the Nevada dark and the one aircraft that did not come home and the weight that Rebecca carried for that specifically and daily without asking anyone to share it. He thought about his hands shaking in the cockpit. He thought about how it had not mattered. He raised his head and looked at Rebecca and said, "Thank you." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the single tight nod of someone who has said what needed to be said and considers the matter properly acknowledged. She turned and walked toward the operations center, and Tyler watched her go, and somewhere in the complicated calculus of everything he had learned in the previous 3 weeks, a final piece settled into place. She had not needed to stay and say that to him. She had 60 pilots to account for, a strike package to debrief, reports to file, and a NATO coordination call in 40 minutes. She had walked directly to him before doing any of that because she understood that the moment mattered, and that the moment was brief, and that someone needed to name what had happened before it got buried under the operational machinery that was about to resume. She had not done it for his benefit. She had done it because it was true, and true things deserved to be said. Tyler filed that understanding carefully in the place where he kept things he intended to carry for the rest of his career. He picked up his helmet bag and walked toward the building, and the Nevada sun was full and high and bright on the flight line, and somewhere behind him the medical team was finishing with Noah, and somewhere above them the sky was enormous and clear and patient. The wing commander scheduled the closed debrief for 1900 hours that evening, which gave the pilots enough time to eat, shower, and process the day without enough time to let the processing calcify into either false heroism or unnecessary self-destruction. Rebecca had recommended the timing. She understood that the window between immediate reaction and settled narrative was where the most honest conversations lived, and she intended to use it. Tyler arrived early. He had not planned to arrive early. He had planned to arrive at exactly the right moment, professional, composed, neither the first nor the last. But he had finished eating before the others, and then found that sitting in his quarters with nothing to do except think was producing a specific kind of internal noise that he could not manage by staying still. So he walked to the debrief room and sat in a chair near the middle and looked at the blank display on the wall and let himself exist in the quiet for a few minutes before anyone else arrived. His hands had stopped shaking approximately 2 hours after the recovery. He had noticed the moment they steadied, sitting in the maintenance debrief, listening to the technical team describe the electrical fault they had traced through Noah's aircraft, tracking the sequence of system failures with the particular attention of a pilot who understood that today's emergency was tomorrow's checklist revision. His hands had been resting on the table, and at some point between the discussion of the primary electrical bus and the secondary fault isolation logic, the tremor had simply stopped. He had not told anyone about the shaking. He had not decided to conceal it. It simply had not come up, and he had not offered it. It felt like something that belonged to the cockpit, to the specific 40-minute window of the recovery, and he was not sure yet what it meant or how to talk about it, or whether talking about it was even the right thing to do. What he knew was that it had been real, and that he had continued flying through it, and that Noah was on the ground safe. Those 3 facts felt sufficient for now. Pilots began arriving in ones and twos, and the room filled with the particular quality of sound that a room full of pilots produces after a mission that went wrong, and then right conversations that were more careful than usual, a certain deliberateness in the way people moved and chose their seats, the collective awareness that something significant had occurred, and that the group had not yet decided how to hold it. The NATO contingent arrived together. Weber came in without looking at Tyler directly, which Tyler had learned meant Weber was processing something privately and would communicate when he was ready. Eriksson from Norway sat 2 seats down from Tyler, and when their eyes met briefly, Eriksson gave him a nod that Tyler interpreted correctly as the highest level of approval the Norwegian pilot had communicated to anyone all week. Rebecca arrived last, which was her pattern. She never arrived first. She had told Tyler once in the passing that a commander who arrives first starts managing the room before the room is ready to be managed, which was counterproductive. She never arrived last in the sense of being late. She arrived at the moment when the room was full and settled and ready for the conversation to begin. She stood at the front without notes. The strike package was completed within established parameters, she said. 41 of 42 objectives achieved. The opposing force's electronic deception was well executed and produced the intended confusion in the eastern quarter, which the eastern section handled correctly. She paused. Bennett experienced a genuine aircraft malfunction. The exercise, termination, and recovery were conducted appropriately. She looked at the room. I want to talk about what happened in the eastern corridor before the malfunction And then I want to talk about the recovery. Both matter, in different ways. The room was completely attentive, not in the performed way of people watching a superior officer because the situation requires it, but in the genuine way of people who understand that something worth hearing is about to be said. Before the malfunction, Rebecca said, Lieutenant Mercer identified the decoy contact and advised Lieutenant Bennett not to pursue it. The decision was correct. The reasoning behind it was also correct, and the reasoning matters more than the decision, because a correct decision made for wrong reasons is luck, not judgment. She looked at Tyler briefly. Lieutenant Mercer compared the contact's behavior against the mission timeline, the geographic context, the fuel situation, and the overall pattern of the opposing force's behavior throughout the ingress. He did not simply decide the display was wrong. He built a case for why the display was showing him something that required skepticism. That is what we have been working on. Tyler sat still. He was aware of the room around him processing this, the NATO pilots, his own squadron members, the young officers in the back row, who had watched the telemetry from the operations center and seen what Tyler had done without having the context to fully understand it. Then Rebecca said something that nobody in the room had predicted. Now I want to talk about Lieutenant Mercer's errors. The room shifted. Tyler sat forward slightly. Rebecca addressed the room, not Tyler specifically, which made it more and less comfortable simultaneously. During the initial emergency response, Lieutenant Mercer's first 3 transmissions to Lieutenant Bennett were technical. He provided checklist items, system status queries, and numerical data from his own display. This is the instinct of a technically proficient pilot, and it is often the wrong instinct in an emergency involving a disoriented crew member. She paused to let this settle. When a pilot is disoriented, when their displays are unreliable, and their spatial orientation is degrading and their cognitive load is already at ceiling, more data is not the solution. More data from an external source that cannot be fully verified against their own compromised instruments adds to the noise rather than cutting through it. Lieutenant Mercer provided several accurate pieces of information that Lieutenant Bennett could not effectively integrate at that moment. Tyler heard this and did not defend himself. He heard it and recognized it and felt it land in the place where accurate criticism lands when you are trying to be honest with yourself, which is not comfortable, but is something considerably better than comfortable. What changed the situation, Rebecca continued, was when Lieutenant Mercer shifted approach. He stopped providing data and started providing a reference. He told Lieutenant Bennett to stop looking at instruments and look at his aircraft instead. He made himself the reliable thing in an environment where reliable things had become scarce. A brief pause. That decision saved time, reduced Bennett's cognitive load, and made the subsequent recovery possible. It was the correct decision, and it was reached approximately 90 seconds later than it needed to be. Tyler thought about those 90 seconds. He had not quantified them in the moment. He had been moving through the problem as fast as he could. Now he thought about what 90 seconds meant at that point in the emergency, with NOAA's fuel decreasing and the weather conditions evolving and the terrain route ahead. And he understood exactly what Rebecca was saying without needing her to complete the implication. 90 seconds. In a real environment with real margins, 90 seconds could be the difference between options and no options. He filed it. He filed it in the place where he kept things he was not going to repeat. Rebecca went through the rest of the recovery analysis with the same precision. The terrain route decision, the approach, guidance, the arresting cable plan. She acknowledged each element factually and without drama. She noted what had been correct and why it had been correct, and she noted what had been delayed and why the delay had cost something even though the outcome had been acceptable. She was thorough. She was fair. She was not kind in the sentimental sense. She was kind in the only sense that mattered, and she was honest. And she was honest because she believed that Tyler could use the honesty, which was the highest form of respect she knew how to give. When she finished, she looked at the room one more time. "This exercise is not over," she said. "We have 3 days remaining. Use them." She looked at Tyler. "Lieutenant Mercer, stay behind." The room emptied in the specific way that rooms empty when the people leaving them have been given something real to think about. Not quickly, not with conversation, but with the careful movements of people who are carrying new weight and adjusting to its distribution. Weber was the last NATO pilot out. He paused at the door for precisely 2 seconds, and met Tyler's eyes with an expression that was not quite a smile and was not quite anything else Tyler had a name for, and then he was gone. The room was empty except for Tyler and Rebecca. Rebecca sat down for the first time not at the front of the room but in the chair directly across from Tyler, which changed the geometry of the conversation in a way Tyler noticed and appreciated. She was not standing over him. She was across from him, which was a different thing entirely. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Tyler said, "I owe you an apology." Rebecca looked at him. "For what specifically?" "For the conference," Tyler said, "for challenging you publicly. I judged you before I knew anything real about you. I decided your reputation was built on mystery rather than substance, because I hadn't seen the substance yet, and I was arrogant enough to treat my own ignorance as evidence." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "That's an accurate assessment," she said. Tyler waited for more. There was no more. He almost smiled. "You're not going to tell me it's all right." "It was not all right," Rebecca said. "It also wasn't the most important part of the situation, which is why I didn't address it the way you expected me to." She looked at him steadily. "If I had shut you down in that room, you would have obeyed me, and you would have spent the rest of your career privately, certain that you had been right and that the institution had simply refused to let the question be tested. You would have carried that certainty into every cockpit you ever flew and every decision you ever made and every wingman you were ever responsible for." Tyler said, "So you fought me instead. I gave you the environment where your philosophy could be tested on its own terms." She said, "You believed that complete trust in the system would produce superior outcomes. You too experienced the conditions under which that belief failed. Not be told about them, not read about them, not have them described by someone you had already decided was representing an obsolete generation. You needed to feel them." Tyler thought about his second engagement, about the moment his display had shown him Rebecca's projected position and he had committed to it before it updated, about the 2 seconds between what the system showed and what was real. "The gap," he said. Rebecca nodded. "The gap is always there. Modern systems have made it smaller. Smaller is not eliminated. And against an opponent who understands your system's characteristics, smaller can still be fatal." Tyler leaned forward slightly. "Can I ask you something?" She waited. "Why did you give me the call on the terrain road?" He said it carefully because the question had been in him since the moment she said make the call, and he understood what she was transferring. "You had the information. You had more experience with that specific category of decision than I will have for another decade. The mathematically correct thing to do was take control of the recovery yourself." Rebecca looked at him for a long moment, long enough that Tyler wondered whether she was going to answer at all, or whether this was the version of the question that she would set aside. Then she said, "Because it was your wingman." Tyler waited. "I could have managed that recovery from 40 miles away," she said. "I have done similar things before. I have the experience, the pattern recognition, the confidence in my own judgment under those conditions. I could have taken control of the communications, directed the approach, and brought Bennett home from a distance." She paused. "And if I had done that, you would have let me. You would have been grateful, and you would have learned nothing." The truth of this arrived in Tyler's chest before his brain finished processing the words. "I needed you to be his reference," Rebecca said. "Not because it was the optimal tactical choice, because it was the right thing for both of you. Bennett needed to trust one person completely, and it needed to be the person flying next to him. And you needed to discover what you are capable of when the choice is yours and the cost is real." Tyler sat with this for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "I was scared." Rebecca looked at him. "During the approach," he said, "when you said he had one opportunity, I was genuinely scared." He said it the way someone says something they have been deciding whether to say for several hours, not with performance, not with the careful calibration of a man managing his image, but with the flat directness of someone who has decided that honesty is more useful than presentation. "My hands were shaking in the cockpit." Rebecca said nothing for a moment. "Then I know." Tyler looked at her. "You knew?" "Your voice changed slightly during the approach guidance," she said. "Not in a way that anyone who didn't know what to listen for would have detected. But yes, I knew." A brief pause. "And I want you to understand something about that." He waited. "The shaking hands," she said, "are not the problem. The shaking hands are the nervous system's honest response to a high-stakes situation. They are physiological, they are real, they are appropriate. She looked at him steadily. The question is never whether you feel the fear. The question is what you do while you feel it. Tyler held her gaze. You talked him down, she said, with shaking hands. You held your position in turbulence, managed your own fuel, tracked the terrain, monitored his voice, made the approach call, and guided him to the cable. With shaking hands, she paused. That is not despite the fear. That is through the fear. Those are different things, and the difference is everything. Something released in Tyler's chest. Not completely, the weight of the day was still there, and he expected it would be there for some time. But something in the specific tightness that had been sitting behind his sternum since the moment the range safety officer called the exercise terminated, something in that particular knot loosened. He said, I want to know about the mission. Rebecca was quiet. The one that gave you the call sign, Tyler said. Weber told me part of it, the part that's allowed to be told, but I think there's a part he didn't tell me. Rebecca looked at the wall display for a moment. The display was dark, the telemetry from the day's mission had been cleared. She looked at the blank surface for a long time. Then she said, there's a secure briefing room down the hall. Colonel Whitaker asked to be present for this conversation. Tyler understood that this was not a casual invitation. He followed her. The secure briefing room was small and deliberately plain. No windows, no decorations, nothing on the walls except a mounted display and a whiteboard. Colonel Samuel Whitaker was already there, seated at the head of the small table, a senior officer with the specific bearing of a man who has spent a long career doing things that do not appear in public records. Lucas Weber was also there, sitting to Whitaker's left with his hands folded on the table and the particular stillness of a man who has told part of a story before and is now present to tell the rest of it. Tyler sat across from Weber and felt the weight in the room. Not oppressive weight, the weight of things that mattered and had been carried carefully. Whitaker said, what I'm about to tell you is not classified at the level that requires formal clearance. It is sensitive at the human level, which is a different kind of classification. I'm telling you because Colonel Callahan believes you have earned the context and I trust her judgment. Tyler nodded. Whitaker looked at Rebecca briefly. She gave nothing visible in return, just the steady, contained attention she always gave everything. Whitaker began. It had been a NATO reassurance mission in Eastern Europe several years earlier, during a period of elevated tension along the eastern border, that the public news cycle had described as a diplomatic disagreement, while the people actually operating in that airspace understood it as something considerably more serious. Rebecca had led a 4-aircraft multinational formation herself, Weber, a British pilot named Hargreaves, and a Belgian officer named de Cruz. The mission was routine, the kind of routine that exists in tense airspace, which is to say not routine at all, but familiar enough that the rhythms of it had established themselves and the pilots were operating within those rhythms with the professional efficiency of people who have done this enough times to know what to expect. Then the electronic attack came. Tyler had heard this part from Weber. The communications disruption, the navigation corruption, the rapid degradation of the formation's situational awareness as the attack layered interference across their systems with a sophistication that made it clear. This was not an automated response, but an active real-time effort by operators who knew exactly what they were doing. Hargreaves was injured, a medical situation, not combat-related, the kind of thing that happens when a body under stress does what bodies sometimes do. He was functional enough to fly, but not functional enough to make reliable decisions. De Cruz lost navigation completely. Tyler looked at him across the table. Weber lost reliable navigation and had a partial electrical failure that left him able to fly, but unable to confirm his position independently. Rebecca's own systems were also degraded. Command ordered the formation to separate and recover individually. It was the safe call from a command perspective, the call that protected against the possibility of a mid-air collision in a degraded navigation environment, the call that gave each pilot the clearest individual path to a recovery option. Rebecca had listened to the order, and then she had looked at her formation and understood that 2 of them would probably not make it back alone. Hargreaves managing his medical situation, navigating through a disrupted electronic environment to a divert airfield he had never used. De Cruz with no reliable navigation in airspace that was actively hostile to radio emissions that might allow a direction-finding solution. She had made a decision in approximately 4 seconds. She shut down all non-essential emissions from her own aircraft, not to hide from the enemy, though that was an effect, but because she needed to move, and moving with emissions meant being tracked. And being tracked meant the formation she was about to build around herself would be tracked too. She descended beneath the enemy radar picture, placed the 3 damaged aircraft in close formation around her, and began moving toward friendly airspace using the last reliable navigation she had: dead reckoning, terrain association timing, and 40 miles of memorized route structure that she had built in her own mind during the ingress. Because she always did that, because she had learned long ago that the system you have memorized is the one that survives when everything else fails. For 40 minutes, she flew through darkness, deteriorating weather, and unfamiliar terrain, while transmitting only the absolute minimum communication required to keep 3 damaged aircraft within visual range of her wings. No more than necessary. Nothing that gave the enemy a clean fix on their position. The enemy lost them. Allied controllers also lost them and sent the communications that Whitaker quietly described as the ones no one in operations wanted to send, the communications that acknowledged the probability of loss and began the accounting that follows when aircraft do not return. Then Rebecca's formation emerged near the border of friendly airspace, and the NATO controller on duty that night transmitted on a frequency that everyone in the operations center could hear: "The ghosts are coming home." Tyler sat very still through all of this. He had heard the shape of the story from Weber. He had understood the outline. But hearing it with Whitaker's specificity, in Weber's physical presence, in the weight of a secure briefing room at the end of the most significant day of Tyler's professional life, hearing it this way changed its character entirely. He understood now with a completeness he had not had before that Ghost was not a celebration. It was a record. He looked at Rebecca, who had been sitting without expression through Whitaker's account, and said, "Weber told me there was a 5th pilot." The room changed. Weber's hands moved on the table, a slight adjustment, the movement of someone managing a response. Whitaker's expression did not change in any visible way, but something behind his eyes did. Rebecca said yes. Tyler waited. "Another formation," she said, "operating in an adjacent sector. They experienced similar disruptions from the same electronic attack." She paused for exactly 2 seconds. "I knew they were there. I was aware of their position when I made the decision to collect my formation and move for friendly airspace." Tyler understood immediately what she was saying and what she was not saying. "You couldn't go for them," he said. Not a question. A statement of arithmetic: the fuel state, the formations, the navigational constraints, the injured pilot, the degraded aircraft. "I calculated it," Rebecca said. "In the 4 seconds before I made my decision, I ran the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said that attempting to reach the adjacent formation would have put all 3 of my pilots at unacceptable risk." A pause. "The arithmetic was correct." "But," Tyler said. She looked at him. "But mathematics does not account for the weight of a correct answer." She held his gaze and said, with a directness that cost her something visible to anyone watching carefully, "I have never been certain that I was right. I am certain that I ran the calculation correctly. I am not certain that the calculation was sufficient." The room was completely silent. Tyler thought about the faded patch on her shoulder, the single gray word. He thought about Weber's description on that first evening. "She is called Ghost because enemy pilots often realize she was there only after everyone under her protection has already escaped." He had heard that as a tactical description, a way of fighting. He understood now that it was also a weight she carried. Every day, in the patch she wore on her left shoulder, not as a decoration, not as a celebration, but as a record. 3 she had brought home, 1 she had not. A memorial patch. Not for the dead pilot, for her own accounting, for the question she would never be fully able to answer. He said very quietly, "That's why you agreed to fight me." Rebecca looked at him. "If you had silenced me with rank," Tyler said, "I would have kept flying the way I was flying." And eventually, he stopped. He did not need to finish the sentence. "Eventually the arithmetic would have been wrong," Rebecca said, "and someone would have paid for it." Tyler thought about Noah's voice saying, "You didn't leave." He thought about his shaking hands on the controls. He thought about the 90 seconds Rebecca had identified in the debrief, the 90 seconds he had spent providing data instead of presence. In a real environment, those 90 seconds might have been the ones that mattered. He said, "How do you carry it, the one you couldn't reach?" Rebecca looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he thought she was not going to answer. Then she said, "I don't try to put it down. I stopped trying to put it down a long time ago." She was quiet for a moment. "What I do is make sure that the weight of it improves the decisions I make going forward. Not as punishment, as information." She paused. "The pilot I could not reach deserves to be part of every calculation I make about what it costs to leave someone behind. Not as guilt, as precision." Tyler thought about this for a long time. Weber had not spoken since Tyler arrived in the room. Now he said quietly, "I have carried my own version of that night for a long time." He looked at Tyler. "The night I almost did not come home, I was flying the way you were flying when you arrived here. I trusted my systems completely. I believed that my training had prepared me for everything." He looked at his hands. "I was wrong about what everything meant." Tyler said, "What changed it for you?" Weber looked at Rebecca briefly, then at Tyler. "I spent 40 minutes in the dark in a damaged aircraft, with no reliable navigation, following a pair of wings that refused to leave me behind." He was quiet for a moment. "When we crossed into friendly airspace, I did not feel relief first. I felt a specific recognition that I had been wrong about something important, and that the wrongness had nearly cost me and others everything, and that I needed to understand why before I flew another sortie." He looked at Tyler steadily. "You are further ahead than I was. It took me 6 months to reach what you reached today." Tyler held Weber's gaze and understood that this was not comfort. It was honest measurement. It was the specific acknowledgement of one person to another that a real thing had happened and that the real thing had been seen. He looked at Rebecca. "Why are you telling me all of this tonight?" She considered the question with the care she brought to everything. Then she said, "Because tomorrow you are going to fly again, and the day after that. And for the rest of your career, you are going to make decisions that affect other people in conditions that will sometimes be clear and sometimes be very far from clear." She paused. "I need you to understand the full weight of what that means. Not the version that looks good in briefings. The version that exists at 3 in the morning when you are reviewing a decision you cannot undo." Tyler absorbed this. "The call sign is not a reward," Rebecca said. "It is not a trophy. It is a reminder." She looked at him with the complete steady attention that had characterized everything she had done since the first moment he had seen her in the briefing room. Every pilot who knows the story knows both parts. The 3 who came home, and the one who did not. Tyler looked at the dark display on the wall. He thought about Noah. He thought about his own call sign, Blaze, and what Rebecca had said about it on the first day. Blazes burn bright and disappear. He thought about what it meant to be the kind of pilot that people could find when the sky stopped being reliable. I thought about the one aircraft that had not come home and the weight Rebecca had carried for it, in the way that weight had shaped every lesson she had given him since the moment he stood up in a briefing room and told her that her generation's methods were obsolete. She had not been angry. She had not been dismissive. She had taken his challenge and used it precisely, deliberately, without waste, to teach him the thing he most needed to know. Because she understood what it cost when a capable pilot stayed wrong. She had paid that cost before. She was not willing to let him pay it. Tyler looked at her across the small table in the secure briefing room and felt something settle in him that he did not have a word for and did not need one. It was the feeling of a thing properly understood. Not perfectly, he would be understanding pieces of this conversation for the rest of his career, but properly, as a foundation rather than a conclusion. He said, "Thank you for telling me." Whitaker nodded once. Weber looked at the table and then back at Tyler and gave him a small, specific nod that said something had been transferred correctly and had arrived whole. Rebecca stood. "Get some sleep," she said. "We have 3 days left." Tyler stood. He walked to the door and he stopped there for a moment with his hand on the frame, because something had been waiting in him since the beginning of the evening, and he had been deciding throughout all of it whether to say it. He said, "The patch, the word ghost, you wear it every day." She looked at him from across the... "For both of them," he said, "not just the 3 you brought home." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Yes." He nodded. He walked out into the Nevada night, and the air was cool and enormous around him, and somewhere across the base, the aircraft were in their shelters, being serviced and maintained for tomorrow. And in 3 days, the exercise would end, and the pilots would return to their units, and the specific temporary community of Nellis would dissolve back into its constituent pieces. But something had shifted in Tyler Mercer that would not dissolve. He could feel it the way you feel a fundamental change in structure, not in one place, not dramatically, but in the way everything subsequent would be organized around it. He walked back to his quarters under the stars, and his hands were steady, and his mind was quiet, and somewhere behind his sternum, the place that had been tight all day was finally fully open. He had come to Nellis Air Force Base to prove something. I was leaving with something considerably more valuable. He just had 3 more days to understand how to use it. 3 months is not a long time in the arc of a military career. It is not long enough to erase a reputation or rebuild one from scratch, or fully undo the habits of a lifetime. Tyler knew this. He was not operating under the illusion that the person he had been when he arrived at Nellis had been replaced by someone entirely different. The reflexes were the same. The processing speed was the same. The deep, structural competitiveness that had driven him since his first day in a cockpit, that was the same too. But something underneath all of it had changed. The foundation had shifted, and when a foundation shifts, everything built on top of it settles into a different configuration, even if the individual pieces look identical from the outside. I was still at Nellis, assigned to an advanced tactics program that Rebecca had quietly arranged before the red flag exercise concluded. He had not asked for the assignment. He had not known it was being arranged. He had simply received the orders and understood without needing it explained that this was Rebecca's answer to the question he had asked her implicitly on the first day, the question of what he was actually capable of when the conditions demanded more than exceptional reflexes and a perfect sensor picture. She was giving him the environment to find out. The advanced tactics program was smaller than the red flag exercise. 12 pilots, rotating instructors, a curriculum that was less about teaching specific techniques and more about forcing pilots to confront the limits of their existing frameworks and build something more durable in the space where the limits were. It was Tyler had come to understand exactly the kind of program that Rebecca had been running informally on him for 3 weeks before he had understood what was happening. I was better at it now, better at sitting with uncertainty without attacking it, better at listening to wingmen, to maintenance crews, to the pilots who had flown aircraft he had never flown in conditions he had never experienced. He had discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that people who had information he needed were everywhere, and that they talked freely to pilots who approached them as sources rather than as subordinates. He asked more questions than he had ever asked before in his life. He answered fewer than he used to. Noah had returned to flying 3 weeks after the emergency recovery, once the investigators had traced the electrical fault to a rare manufacturing variance in a secondary bus component and issued the technical guidance that addressed it across the fleet. His return to flight status had been medically and administratively straightforward. His return to the flight line had been something else. Tyler had been there when Noah walked out to his aircraft for the first time since the recovery. He had not planned to be there. He had a planning session scheduled at the same time, but he had rescheduled the planning session without fully explaining why. And he had been on the flight line when Noah arrived. Noah had seen him standing there and stopped. "You didn't have to come," Noah said. "I know," Tyler said. Noah looked at his aircraft for a moment, then back at Tyler. "I've been thinking about what you said on the approach." Tyler waited. "You said I was doing exactly right," Noah said. "When I was sure I wasn't. When I was sure I was about to lose it completely." He paused. "How did you know I needed to hear that instead of more checklist items?" Tyler thought about this carefully because Noah was asking a real question and deserved a real answer. "I didn't know," he said. "I heard your voice change. The breathing behind your words." He paused. "I stopped listening to what you were saying and started listening to how you were saying it. And what I heard was someone who was still trying, someone who hadn't quit, someone who needed to know that someone else could see that." Noah was quiet for a moment. "Rebecca taught you that," he said. Tyler thought about it. "She created the conditions where I had to learn it myself," he said. "There's a difference." Noah nodded slowly. Then he picked up his helmet bag and walked to his aircraft, and Tyler watched him go and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. The moment that tested everything Tyler had learned arrived on a Tuesday morning in a planning room that smelled like coffee and dry erase markers 7 weeks into the advanced tactics program. A new pilot had arrived 2 days earlier, His name was Lieutenant Marcus Webb, and he was 24 years old, and he carried himself with the specific energy of someone who had been the best at everything he had ever attempted and had not yet encountered the thing that would require him to reconsider what best actually meant. Tyler recognized him immediately, not from any prior meeting but from memory, the specific visceral memory of what he himself had looked like from the outside 3 months earlier. The set of the shoulders, the quality of the attention, sharp evaluating, calculating the room. The certainty that occupied every movement like a frequency. Tyler had watched Marcus for 2 days without saying anything, partly because he wanted to understand the specific shape of the young pilot's certainty before he engaged with it, and partly because he remembered how much he had disliked being managed by people who had decided what he needed before they had listened to what he was actually saying. On Tuesday morning, Marcus sat down at the planning table, put his coffee cup down with the easy confidence of someone making himself at home, and said to the room in general, "I've been reviewing the advanced tactics curriculum. The foundational assumptions are based on threat models that are at least 4 years old. Modern sensor integration that has changed the calculus significantly. I think we're training people to manage information gaps that fifth-generation aircraft largely eliminate." The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for a speaker to finish. The weighted quiet of people who had heard this before, who had several of them heard it from Tyler himself in a different room in front of more people with greater certainty and greater volume. Everyone looked at Tyler. I was aware of the expectation in the room. He could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure, the collective anticipation of an audience that has assembled for a specific performance and is waiting for the first line. Marcus looked at him too with the particular alertness of someone who has realized they may have stepped into something they did not fully map before speaking. Tyler picked up his coffee cup. He took a drink. He set it back down. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a map. Not a digital display, a physical paper topographic map of the Nevada range, the kind that existed before systems integration. The kind that pilots had used when the system between their ears was the only navigation tool available. He placed it on the table in front of Marcus. "Walk me through it," Tyler said. Marcus looked at the map, then at Tyler. "Walk you through what?" "Your damaged wingman," Tyler said. "No reliable navigation, limited fuel, broken communications, deteriorating weather, one approach opportunity." He looked at Marcus steadily. "Walk me through how you bring him home." The room was very still. Marcus looked at the map. He looked at it with the expression of someone who is genuinely intelligent, encountering a problem that their existing framework has not equipped them to solve, not the blank look of someone who does not understand the question, but the more complex expression of someone who understands the question precisely and has just discovered that their answer is incomplete. He was quiet for a long moment. Tyler did not rush him. He sat and waited with the patience of someone who had been on the other side of this silence and knew exactly how long it needed to be given. Finally, Marcus said, "I would use the aircraft systems to establish his position relay, accurate data to him, and vector him to the nearest suitable runway." "His systems are unreliable," Tyler said. "Your data disagrees with his display. He can't verify which one of you is correct." Marcus thought about this. He stopped. Thought again. "I would request range control intervention. Range control cannot reach him. Communications are degraded." Another pause. Longer this time. "I would climb above the weather layer and attempt to reestablish communications. Your fuel won't support the climb and a subsequent recovery to an alternate airfield." Marcus put his hands flat on the map. He looked at it. He was working the problem, genuinely, seriously working it, and what he was encountering was a specific wall that Tyler had hit 3 months ago in an entirely different way. The wall where data runs out and judgment must begin, and the pilot discovers whether they have developed judgment or only the appearance of it. Tyler leaned forward slightly. He said, not unkindly, "The aircraft can tell you what it sees. It cannot tell you who you are responsible for." Marcus looked up. "That's the gap," Tyler said. "Not between the old technology and the new technology, between information and responsibility. Your systems can give you everything they're designed to give you and still leave you completely unprepared for the moment when your wingman needs you to be something the system cannot be." He paused. "A fixed point," he said, "something reliable in an environment where reliable things have disappeared. That's not a skill the simulator teaches. That's not a metric that scores. That's something you have to discover you're capable of in the moment when it counts, and there is no other option. The room was quiet. Marcus looked at the map for a long time. When he looked up, something had shifted in his expression, not the dramatic thunderclap shift of movie epiphanies, but the quieter, more honest shift of someone who has encountered a real thing and is beginning to take its measure. "How do you learn it?" he asked. And the question was genuine, stripped of performance, stripped of the competitive alertness that had characterized every other thing he had said since arriving. Tyler looked at him. "You pay attention to every person who depends on your decisions," he said. "You listen to their voices, not just their words. You study the decisions that came before yours and what they actually cost, not just what they produced. And when the moment comes when everything your aircraft can give you isn't enough, and someone needs you to be the thing they navigate by, you don't hesitate. You don't calculate your own position first." He paused. "You become the reference, and then you stay there." Marcus absorbed this. Around the table, the other pilots in the program were very quiet. Several of them had been at Nellis for the red flag exercise. Several of them had watched Tyler's telemetry from the operations center on the morning of the one-on-one engagement. All of them had heard what happened on the day of Noah's emergency recovery. They were watching Tyler give Marcus the lesson that had cost Tyler something real to learn, and giving it without the cost showing, without drama, without the performance of a man demonstrating his own transformation. He was giving it as simple, direct, honest information. The way Rebecca gave everything. It occurred to Tyler, sitting at that table, that this was what teaching actually looked like when it was done correctly. Not the transfer of information, the transfer of framework, the creation of conditions in which another person could begin to understand what they actually needed to understand rather than what they thought they were asking about. Rebecca had done it for him. He was doing it now. And somewhere down the hall in an office that Tyler knew the location of and visited approximately 3 times a week for debriefs that had become the most valuable conversations of his professional life, Rebecca Callahan was doing exactly what she always did in the moments between the visible events. She was paying attention to everything. She heard the exchange in the planning room. Not because she had been listening at the door, she had been walking past on her way to a coordination meeting, and the voices had been clear through the open doorway. She had stopped without meaning to. She had stood in the hallway for the duration of Tyler's answer to Marcus's question. She had not entered the room. When Tyler finished speaking, she turned and continued down the hallway, and a small specific thing crossed her face that was not quite a smile and was not quite anything else with a common name. It was the expression of someone who has invested something real and has just seen the return on that investment manifest in a form that is better than what they planned for. She walked to her coordination meeting and said nothing about it to anyone. That was the final week of Tyler's assignment to the Advanced Tactics program. The final red flag mission was scheduled for Friday, a full package exercise with degraded sensors, deceptive contacts, simulated losses, everything that the Nevada range it could produce in 4 hours of contested airspace. And for the first time, Tyler was assigned to lead a 4-aircraft formation. He received the assignment without the response that would have defined him 3 months earlier, without the surge of vindication, without the internal scorekeeping of a man who believes he has finally been given what he deserved. He received it as responsibility, as the formal acknowledgement that he was now the person that 3 other pilots would navigate by when the conditions stopped making sense. He spent Thursday evening preparing with a thoroughness that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone. He studied the threat environment. He built contingency plans for fuel states, weather changes, communication, degradation, simulated losses. He thought through the specific capabilities and limitations of each pilot in his formation and built his plan around the reality of what they could actually do under pressure rather than what their records said they should be able to do. He called each of them individually Thursday night. Not to brief them, the formal brief was Friday morning. Just to talk, to hear their voices, to understand what each of them was carrying into the mission that would not appear on any display. It was something Rebecca had done before every significant mission Tyler had flown with her. He had noticed it without understanding it at the time. He understood it now. Friday's mission was everything the Nevada range promised it would be. The electronic environment was aggressive and creative. The deceptive contacts were well designed, and the simulated losses arrived at intervals specifically chosen to put maximum pressure on the formation lead's decision-making at the worst possible moments. Tyler made mistakes. Two of them both recognized and corrected in real time, both documented for the post-mission review. He did not make the mistake of chasing the easy victory when it appeared in front of him, which had been his defining failure 3 months earlier. He did not chase the confirmation that he was the best pilot in the sky. He kept his formation together through the most demanding phase of the mission, protected the support aircraft, and completed the objective without losing a single wingman. When they crossed the recovery boundary and the range safety officer called the exercise complete, Tyler's voice on the radio was steady and quiet and said only what needed to be said. Nothing extra, nothing that performed, just the professional minimal communication of a formation lead confirming his section's status and proceeding to recovery. He landed last. Formation leads always land last. He had known this rule for his entire career. It had always struck him as ceremonial, the tradition of seniority and precedence in the landing sequence. He understood it differently now. The formation lead lands last because the formation lead's job is not complete until every other aircraft is on the ground. You stay in the air until the people who depend on your decisions are safe. Then you come home. Untaxied in and shut down and climbed down from the cockpit, and the Nevada afternoon was bright and warm, and the flight line smelled like jet exhaust and hot asphalt and everything that had characterized the last 3 months of his life. Rebecca was waiting near the squadron building. She was not alone. Whitaker was there, and Weber, who had extended his stay for the final week of the program, and Noah, who had come from across the base because Tyler had not told him about the leadership assignment, but someone else had. The group was not large or ceremonial. It was simply the people who had been present for the actual story, gathered in the informal way of people who understand that some moments do not need orchestration. Tyler walked to them with his helmet bag over his shoulder, and Rebecca met him a few steps from the group. She held out a patch. He took it and looked at it. New fabric, but the same format as the faded gray patch on her shoulder. The same shape, the same size, the same deliberate simplicity. One word printed clean against the dark background. Shepherd. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Rebecca. Blaze is gone, he said. She held his gaze. Blazes burn bright and disappear, she said. Shepherds make sure everyone gets home. Tyler looked at the patch in his hand. He thought about the first morning at Nellis, the briefing room, the 83 pilots, the 4 words she had asked him. He thought about the Nevada range at altitude and the second engagement, and the moment his display had shown him something that was not quite accurate, and he had trusted it completely and paid the price. He thought about Noah's voice on the internal frequency saying, "I'm looking," and the quality of trust in those 2 words. I thought about the secure briefing room and the dark display and the weight of a correct decision that Rebecca had been carrying 4 years because correct had not been sufficient. I thought about the one aircraft that had not come home, and he understood completely and without remainder what the patch in his hand actually meant. Not a reward, not a rank, not a declaration that he had become the best pilot in the sky. A commitment, a daily renewable commitment to be the thing that people could navigate by. To carry the weight of every decision without letting the weight become the reason for making the wrong next one. To know the cost of leaving someone behind with sufficient precision that the cost informed every calculation every time without requiring the lesson to be relearned. He looked at Weber. Weber gave him the small specific nod, the same one he had given in the debrief room after the recovery. The nod that said something real has been transferred and has arrived whole. He looked at Noah, who was standing slightly apart from the group with the quiet, steady presence that Tyler had stopped thinking of as invisibility and started thinking of as something else entirely, the particular strength of a person who knows exactly who they are and does not require the room to confirm it. Noah said simply, "Good flight today." "You saw the telemetry," Tyler said. "Some of it," Noah said. "I saw the part where you pulled the formation back together after the 3rd simulated loss instead of pressing for the objective." He paused. "I saw you choose your people over your score." Tyler held his gaze for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "I did." He looked back at Rebecca, who was watching the exchange with the complete contained attention that was the most constant thing about her. The attention that never judged and never softened and never failed to see exactly what was actually there. "Thank you," Tyler said. She looked at him the way she always looked at everything, directly, without sentiment, without distance. "Don't thank me," she said. "Fly the way you flew today. Do it again tomorrow. Do it for every wingman who follows your aircraft into airspace that doesn't stay friendly. A pause. That's the acknowledgement I want. Tyler nodded. He looked at the patch in his hand one more time. Then he put it in the chest pocket of his flight suit over his heart, the way pilots carry the things they intend to keep. Several months later, at the final multinational gathering, before the Advanced Tactics program concluded its cycle, Tyler stood before an assembled group that included pilots who had been present for everything: the briefing room challenge, the one-on-one engagement, the emergency recovery, the closed debrief, where Whitaker had told the full story of the night Rebecca earned her name. The wing commander asked Tyler to say a few words about the program. Tyler stood in front of the room and looked at the faces senior officers and junior lieutenants, American pilots, and NATO partners, people who had watched him make every mistake and every correction. He thought about what he wanted to say. He thought about what Rebecca would say, which helped him understand what actually needed to be said. He said, "I came here 3 months ago believing that confidence was the same thing as competence, that the system in my aircraft was more reliable than the judgment in my cockpit, that the best pilot in the sky was the one who processed the most information correctly and acted on it fastest." He paused. "I was right about some of that. I was wrong about what it was for." He looked at the room. Speed matters. Precision matters. Understanding your aircraft's systems completely, that matters more than most things. But none of it is worth anything if it stays pointed at the wrong objective. He paused. The objective is not to be the best pilot in the sky. The objective is to be the pilot that your wingman can find when the sky stops making sense. Those are not the same thing, and the day you discover the difference is the day you actually start becoming useful. Rebecca stood near the back of the room. She did not move. She did not change expression. But Tyler felt her attention the way he had felt it from the first morning, complete, direct, without reservation or qualification. He finished speaking. The room was quiet for a moment, in the way that rooms go quiet when something true has been said and needs a moment to settle before the ordinary sounds of the world resume. Then the noise came back and pilots began talking, and the gathering became the informal, human, slightly loud collection of capable people that it had been before Tyler stood up. Tyler walked to the back of the room. Rebecca was already moving toward the door because she always had somewhere to be and something that required her attention, and the business of the institution did not pause for moments of reflection. He fell into step beside her. "Was that all right?" he said, meaning the remarks, meaning the 3 months, meaning all of it. She glanced at him sideways with the expression she sometimes had when a question contained more than the person asking it had fully acknowledged. "It was honest," she said. "That's better than all right." They walked out together into the Nevada morning, and the sky above Nellis was the specific shade of blue that exists only at altitude in high desert, and 2 F-35As were taxiing out at the far end of the field for the first morning sortie, and the day was beginning the way serious days always begin, without ceremony, without announcement, without any external signal that the work of it would matter. But it would. Tyler Mercer had arrived at Nellis Air Force Base certain that he already knew what made a pilot worth trusting. He left knowing that the answer was not about the pilot at all. It was about every person who climbed into a cockpit, counting on someone else to still be there when the instruments failed, and the weather closed, and the fuel ran low, and the only reliable thing left in the sky was the pair of wings flying close enough to follow home. That was what made a pilot worth following. Not the scores, not the certainty, not the speed of the hands or the sharpness of the mind or the brightness of the flame, the willingness to stay.